Hey friends, welcome to BTD. My name's Mark. Today we're talking about ignoring the rules. That's why I unbuttoned my cardigan, because I'm a rebel and I don't need rules. So today we're talking about ignoring rules and the reasons that you might want to do that. And I think when people hear this, when they talk about, ignoring or making up rules, they think of house rules. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today, but that isn't the entirety of what I think this is, of what ignoring rules can be in D&D. Now, certainly house rules, many, probably most DMs and groups have a few. And as long as you're upfront about it, either, hey, here's the house rules that I run with. Does anyone have any issue with them? Does anyone have any questions about them? Usually you're not going to have any issues. Others will come up during play. I know a lot of groups that just vote on things that come up that they think are unintuitive. And a lot of times they'll defer to the DM who will make a ruling. And sometimes that ruling doesn't necessarily jive with the rules as written. And this is okay. As long as you're not breaking anything at the table, most importantly, the trust of players and other players and DM, etc., then you're fine. So I'll probably do another video at some point later on about the house rules that I enjoy or that I use or have used, but I don't want to talk too much about those today because I want to talk about ignoring rules in a little bit more broad sense. So when I think of ignoring rules, and not specifically house rules, I think of narrative powers. So what I mean by narrative powers are things that a DM just does because it needs to happen for the narrative, for the plot. And it doesn't necessarily make perfect sense if you break it down in the context of the game world, in the context of the mechanics that are D&D. Now, you might say, hey, Mark, you just talked about having trust between DM and players. How in the world could you do this and still maintain trust? Well, that's a very important question. I think it's a very simple one to answer, but the answer isn't necessarily obvious. And I think that ignoring rules or creating narrative powers this is usually going to be as it pertains to, say, your villains. Your villains need to be somewhere and then be somewhere else, or they need to do something behind the scenes, and they don't necessarily have, maybe they're not a high enough level spellcaster to do certain things that you would like them to be able to do behind the scenes. And as long as it's not in direct view of your players, just wantonly flouting the fact that you're ignoring the rules of D&D, whatever the villains need to do, I think they should be able to do. And when I say they should be able to do whatever they need to do, I'm talking about to make the plot move forward, to make it compelling. Say, for example, a villain needs to mind control the 3 different rulers of a city, and they're not getting saving throws. It is perpetual. It is complete, and they're able to manipulate and control these rulers, and they don't necessarily have these spellcasting chops to do this, at least this effectively. So can this villain do this? I would say absolutely yes, because then the players roll into town and they have these mind-controlled villains, and that might be an interesting plot quest in order to figure out who's manipulating them behind the scenes, how do they break this control, what other bad things have been going on in the city that these mind-controlled leaders have been overseeing. So there's a lot you could dig into there. And if you cut it off at the head, at the very beginning, by saying that, oh, you know what, this evil sorcerer doesn't have enough mind control spells to be able to do this 24/7, I guess it just can't happen, then you're losing out on a lot of plot. You're losing out on a lot of fun, interesting story that could happen. Now, I think where you can start to lose trust, and where I absolutely wouldn't do this, is during combat. This is where we zoom in. So if the rest of the game is very broad, very abstract, combat is when we zoom in and everything is very precise. In combat, there is a very particular turn order. There are very particular things you can do on your turns. There are certain mechanics, say for example, like legendary actions, that seem to break this traditional turn order, but even those are baked into the game in a way that everybody understands to be part of the game. And if, for example, if the villain just shows up and has a pitch black orb and they activate the orb, and you simply look at the players and you say, all of your characters go blind. This is not good because you're not giving them a saving throw, you're not giving them an option, you're just saying this thing happens because I need it to. It is on you as a DM to come up with a different possible way for them to do that that doesn't take the agency away from the players, that doesn't break the contract that is the combat structure. So there's two ways to do this. One is figure out some other mechanism that happens that, oh, look, he's created this death ray, and if you move into it, everyone becomes blinded, and it's pitch darkness, and it's magical, so even dark vision can't see through it. Maybe you establish this beforehand, so the players know that if they approach the villain, oh no, we are going to be blinded. But if it happens during combat, then to me, that's probably a breach of trust. So I might actually be okay with creating an overpowered, blinding orb like this that the villain could just control to blind everyone in a certain radius around him. But I would definitely establish it beforehand, and I would probably just make it something that happened automatically as they moved toward him, so that they knew if they were to engage him in combat, it would be doing so at a severe disadvantage because they would all be blinded. This allows them to go into combat with their eyes open, pun intended. And at that point, it's more something like, oh, I've created this magical artifact, here's what it does, rather than something that's going to be game-breaking in the combat order that's going to surprise the players in a way that seems unfair. And the rules that you ignore in order to create things, it doesn't always have to be nefarious. So there was a certain point where I wanted the leader of a city to be able to contact the party. The party was working for this leader, this ruler, and she was a powerful wizard, and I just had her create these discs that she gave to the player, and it was essentially the fantasy magical version of those buzzer discs that you get at, say, Applebee's that let you know when your table's ready. And there's absolutely no precedent for this in D&D. I absolutely didn't want to make it a regular part of my game, and without saying it explicitly, my players sort of understood this, so they didn't inquire into the nature of the magic behind the buzzer discs, the magical buzzer discs, so that they could enchant or create their own. They understood that I needed this for a particular plot device during this story arc, so that they had a magical buzzer disc where they could talk to the ruler, and then once the charge was done, that was it. It was over. And we weren't going to see that again in the campaign unless there was another need for it. This wasn't an item that they could put into their pouch and attune to, and there wasn't stats associated with it. It was just something I needed for the narrative, and so I created it. I inserted it into my campaign. I was ignoring the rules, not creating official stats for it, and it helped the game flow. And I think this is one of the great appeals of magic in a broad sense in D&D. When we get into combat, magic has very specific uses, and if you go outside of those, you're probably going to run into some trouble, either with balancing issues or with your players, or again, something like breaching trust. But at the same time, if you're out of combat and something's going on, well, this thing is floating. How is it floating? I don't know. Magic. And I don't mean to use this flippantly. It's not a broad excuse for anything to happen in your world or anything to exist in your world. I think that every time I've sort of just created something from scratch, be it a homebrew item or just some effect like the buzzer discs that created some very particular thing that was for a particular purpose in the story, in the plot, I had a reason behind it. And I think that's the most important thing. It has to make sense within your world. It can't just be arbitrary. If you're just saying, oh, random thing because magic, probably isn't going to go over as well as something that relates directly to the goals of the party or the plot or some NPC because magic. And for much of this, if things are happening behind the scenes, if there's no logistical way that the villain could have been at point A and point B so quickly, you don't have to say because magic, you just don't have to explain it. You probably could explain it. You could say, oh, he has a teleportation circle between these two. But does he have a teleportation circle between 5 different places? How did he do those? How did he create them? How is he keeping them a secret in these guarded locations? You know, you start to ask questions and it becomes more and more implausible. Just don't explain some of that stuff. And it's going to work a lot better because it is in the background. And I think it's perfectly acceptable, even if your players ask you, say they were like, oh, how in the world did this villain get? And they ask you point blank as a DM, how did the villain get from here to here quicker than we did? So if you're familiar with The Emperor's New Groove, there's this scene where they just sort of do the same thing that I would do as a DM. And the villains get somewhere before the heroes when they really shouldn't have been able to. And they point it out in the movie. They're like, how in the world did we get here so fast? And one of the other villain characters says, I don't know, by all accounts it makes no sense. And they just leave it at that. And it's hilarious in the context of the movie. And I'm not saying you necessarily have to just throw that in the face of your players, like, I'm the DM, listen to me, I don't have to explain myself. But at the same time, if one of my players asked me, how did the villain get from here to here so quickly? I would just look at them and go, and I would let them try to figure it out. And maybe later on I would create a specific reason. Is it a teleportation circle? Is it a simulacrum? Is it a clone? Is it a twin? Is there some other way they could have done this? Do they have an airship waiting in the wings? I don't know. But there are a lot of potential ways you could explain it, but chances are you don't need to, and chances are the players aren't going to push hard enough for you to have to create it. But again, at all times, I think there should be a rationale as it relates to the story that you're telling. So if there isn't a reason that you're doing something, it is going to seem arbitrary. It is going to seem like you're bending the rules just because you can. I don't do this unless I think it is going to serve the story, and I don't do this in a way that I think will feel unfair to the players. As long as you're being honest with yourself about those things, I don't think that there's too much fear about ignoring the rules of the world. And of course, we're not really getting into, we touched on it a little bit with items that technically you could consider to be homebrew items. And as soon as you're homebrewing monsters and items, a lot of those really do break the mechanics of the game because that is their purpose. They're to introduce some new mechanic or spell or ability, and as long as it's balanced with other abilities and mechanics and it works within the structure that's already set by combat or the game rules or whatever, then it's fine. But that is sort of a separate discussion. This is more about the narrative powers side of things. So if you're watching and you've ever ignored a rule and it turned into something deliciously cool in your game, I would love to hear those stories. Let me know in the comments. But until the next video, take care.